everyone, and welcome to another News Coolum video and another, I guess, plug side chat. Another musing from the the aftermath of Boltmas, I guess. You know, on one of my trips, and yeah, I'll put a link to it. So I guess this will be a spoiler alert. But on one of my recent Boltmas trips, I visited a Rivian Adventure Network charger for the first time, and is it the closest one to me? It's one of the closer ones to me. But I do want to give a shout out to Rivian. You know, they were a little bit slow, in my opinion, in opening their chargers to non-Rivians, given, you know, they were using the universal standard at the time, the CCS1. And I mean, some of it was maybe just a bit of jealousy because the types of locations that Rivian prioritizes are locations that I, as an EV driver, are more likely to be interested in using. A little bit more off the beaten path, usually a little bit more outdoorsy, right? They're doing great coverage along Highway 395. Rivian, if you're watching this, you need to cover north of Reno. Trust me, right? If it's only Tesla doing superchargers on Highway 395, Rivian, we need you there too, right? We need at least 2 to 3 stations I can think of for the Adventure Network on Highway 395 North. Big truck market, big SUV market, big outdoorsy market. If you're not there, Rivian, that's a problem. So sorry for the distraction, but yeah, so Highway 395 North, get it, Rivian. But my experiences with Rivian at that charger that I used in Santanella were great, right? I had no issues with the chargers themselves. It looks like they've upped their power distribution. It looks like they're now I think 150 kilowatts of total site power per stall, right? So even if the whole site is full, you're still going to be charging at a reasonable pace, which is going to be important for things like the R1S, R1T, where they're, you know, really hoping to be charging at 200 plus kilowatt, but 150 kilowatt is not the end of the world, right? If you're at a site that's completely full, that's still a very usable charging speed. But I want to kind of approach this from a not just a non-Rivian, but from a Bolt EV perspective. And a few different people have chimed in on my video and said, hey, look, the most I get from a Rivian Adventure Network charger is like 43, 44, 45 kilowatt. It's basically for a older Chevrolet Bolt EV. The new Chevrolet Bolt is probably going to be charging just fine, and I'll get into that in a minute. But for the older Bolt EV, it really is capped at 125 amps. This is basically, if you're going to use a Rivian Adventure Network as a Bolt EV owner, go in with it understanding that for you, it's essentially going to be a 50 kilowatt charger. Again, for the Bolt EV, that's not the end of the world either, right? You would like to be charging at 50 kilowatt plus if it's available, but you know, like I said, the types of locations that Rivian is covering with the Adventure Network are the types of locations where you're more than likely going to be taking a leisurely trip anyway. So if you're adding 10 to 15 minutes to your charging stop by charging at 50 kilowatt or 125 amp, 50 kilowatt speed equivalent, then it's not really going to hurt you that much. You're not going to miss those 10 to 15 minutes of additional charging time. But I kind of wanted to get into the weeds about why that's happening and what other EV owners might expect as a result of it. And this is one of those things where I know I get a lot of pushback, especially now, 9, 10 years on. They're saying, you're still driving a Chevy Bolt EV? What the hell are you doing? How are you really going to even test the charging infrastructure? And I will say this. I think there's a unique place that the Bolt EV holds in terms of testing public charging infrastructure, not just in the sense of backward compatibility, but the Bolt EV is really kind of a metronome. It is so consistent, right, and so reliable that if something is going wrong when a Bolt EV is using charging infrastructure, then there's likely something wrong with that charging infrastructure. And it gives you, as a Bolt EV owner, an ability to kind of identify if there are issues, right? And one of them that I call out quite often is a lot of charging hardware, the cabling, the charging, the hardware itself, right, has, and even GM does this internally, they have a 100 amp default when something is not right, whether it's a temperature sensor's out of whack, whether the, a thermistor is down, right? The charging hardware itself will default to 100 amp. That is something that a Bolt EV owner will notice, right? So when you plug in to charge and you're only charging at, 30 something kilowatt, you know that more than likely that hardware is being reduced for some reason to 100 amp. That indicates to you that there's something broken or wrong with that hardware. In this case, though, it's 125 amp. It is a 50 kilowatt equivalent charging speed using the Rivian Adventure Network with the Bolt EV. And like I said, a number of Bolt EV owners have already told me that this has been their experience as well. Looking at the placard on the Rivian Adventure Network hardware, they were saying 750 amps DC, right, on the cabinet, which is telling me that more than likely Rivian is only divvying up their power in 125 amp increments. So it would be basically the 50 kilowatt increments. What I don't know is what that cutoff is, right? And so what my assumption is at this point is, even though the Bolt EV wants to accept a little, right around 150 amps, right? A little bit more than that 125 amp cutoff, that is not enough power for the Rivian Adventure Network hardware to allocate a second module, right? So maybe an EV that pulls 200 amps will be receiving the power from two modules, right? So it'd be a 250 amp allocation. And even though you're only a 200 amp vehicle, you're still going to be getting that second module, that second 125 amp module. And like I said, what I don't know is what that cutoff is, because if it's, say, you have to be using 50% or more, that would maybe make sense. So something like a 62.5 amps, right, of that, then it will, if you're using 63 amps, it will give you the second module. If you're only using 62 amps, maybe it won't, right? And so the implication for this, though, is kind of wider reaching, because there's a lot of EVs that charge at 500 amps. Well, 125 times 4 is 500 amps. So if you're plugged into a Rivian charger wanting 500 amps, then that Adventure Network charger will allocate 4 of these power modules to you. But depending on where their cutoff is, if you go down to, say, only wanting 440 amps, it might actually just pull the rug out from under you and drop you to only 3 modules, right? So now instead of, a max power of 200 kilowatt, right? Or in a case of maybe a 1,000 volt car, 400 kilowatt, but instead of getting that 200 kilowatt, it's going to arbitrarily drop you down to 150. So maybe your car wanted to be charging at 170 kilowatt and you're only going to be getting 150. So I'm not sure exactly how Rivian programmed this in. And so what it is it's likely some parameters predetermined establishing how many of these charging modules you get. And if it's not implemented properly, then what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up having an arbitrary decrease in your charging power based on no longer using enough of that module. Now, I'm hoping that Rivian programmed it in a smart, intelligent way, where if you start off asking for 500 amps and it allocates 4 of these modules, it doesn't take that fourth module away from you until you're done using it, right? So basically, you're first in, you still get it allocated, or maybe it takes it away after someone else plugs in and there's not enough power for both of you to be getting 500 amps or having 4 modules assigned to you. So more testing is needed. I'll need to see exactly how they're working, but this does have an impact on how it distributes power and what people can expect, right? And again, this isn't like earth-shattering stuff. Like I said, it's not the end of the world if you're in a Bolt EV and you're only getting 43, 44 kilowatts. And it's really probably not the end of the world if you're in a EV that should be getting 170 kilowatts and it drops automatically down to 150. You're not losing too much, but again, like I said, it also depends on what Rivian's trigger is for assigning that fourth module and what its trigger is for taking that fourth module away. And there might even be ways of gaming it, right? Like, whereas if you're in a GM EV, right, that suddenly loses the full fourth module because you dipped below, like I said, make 440, 430 amps or whatever. You could just turn on your climate conditioning and that additional draw from the charger might kick you back up and reassign you that fourth module. So there might also be ways of gaming it, but I would like to see maybe an explanation or a more, a clearer explanation from Rivian in terms of how they program their modules, how they distribute their power. In terms of granularity, 50 kilowatt is just not that granule of a power distribution. But now that we're talking about EVs taking, charging at 250, 300, 350, 400 kilowatt, yeah, 50 kilowatt maybe is granular enough. But again, it all depends on how those power modules are assigned and how they're taken away, and what you can expect as an EV owner using the Rivian Adventure Network. So I'd love to hear what you think. What have been your experiences with the Rivian Adventure Network in the Bolt EV or other EVs, right? Have you noticed like a sudden drop in power when your car maybe wouldn't normally have dropped off that way? Or do you get to retain that, say, fourth power module on a 500 amp charging EV until you stop using any of it? And like I said, what do you think about Rivian's distribution of chargers for their Adventure Network, their build out, the pace at which they've opened to non-Rivians, just your overall experiences? Like I said, I had a very pleasant experience. I like the hardware, I like the design, I like the distribution of the sites. I like how quickly, when Rivian decided to open up to non-Rivian owners, how quickly they opened up their stations. I like how Rivian listened to me and is now building multiple charging sites on Highway 395 north of Reno. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching.